So in the 1700s, the British government has a real problem with smugglers who were bringing goods into the country without paying taxes on them and selling them on. And this was incredibly lucrative for the smugglers. They could make a lot of money doing it, but of course it means that the government is missing out. And so, in the 1700s, the government puts quite a lot of effort into stopping the smugglers, and that's what this section's about. To do this, the government in the 1690s introduces a new law enforcement organisation to stop the smugglers and to force them to pay their taxes. And these become known as the revenue men of the customs and excise. Customs were the taxes that were paid on imports, so goods that were being brought into the country. And excise were the taxes that were put onto exports. So if people wanted to sell some of their goods overseas, like wool, they would have to pay a tax on that too. And this is really quite well organised as a law enforcement agency. So, for example, the coastline of Britain, which is where the goods were being brought in, was divided into 33 sections. And each section would be controlled by 3 senior officials, known as the collector, the customer, and the controller. As well as this, port towns would have an extra 5 officers, because that's where goods were being brought in officially, and they were there to check that nobody was sneaking any extra ones through. As well as this, there were teams of riding officers stationed every few miles along the coast, and their job was basically to ride up and down the coastal paths on their horses, checking that no ships were coming in and that no smugglers were unloading goods. And for every 6 of these, there would be a supervisor. So this is really quite well organised, and there's a very clear hierarchy of control and management to it. However, it's not very successful. You might think, looking at the revenue man that I've drawn there, that he looks quite dashing and adventurous, and that's probably because, reading between the lines, I think they had to be. It was a really difficult job, and they probably had to be pretty brave and pretty tough to do it. And it's not very successful because these customs officers were facing a lot of problems. And if we have a look at some examples of smugglers in the 1700s, we can kind of see why. So we have a map over here. And one problem is that the coastline of Britain is very long, and it's also very wiggly. So it's got a lot of hidden places where ships can come in and goods can be stored. This is particularly a problem in Wales. So for example, at the Morphetbicken Sands, near Portmadog, they had a lot of caves at the north end of the shore where smugglers could hide their goods in safety. The Pembrokeshire coast, similarly, had so much smuggling that even now some of the place names in it give us a clue as to what was going on there. So places like Smuggler's Lane or Brandy Cove are a lasting relic of what was happening there. Another problem is that smugglers were often pretty wealthy. So, for example, in Gower, at a place called Salthouse, which is about here, a family called the Lucas family were able to smuggle goods for about 200 years, up until 1703 with the death of John Lucas. And they apparently, legend has it, that they had secret passages built from their house to the shore where the smugglers could drop off their goods and get them to safety. Then again, the smugglers were often running really large-scale operations. And the best example I have of this is a gang called the Hadley Gang that were operating in East Anglia at a place called Sizewell Beach. So the Hadley Gang at Sizewell Beach. And apparently in 1745 they managed in 6 months to transport and smuggle 4,551 cartloads of dry goods and tea. And that's in just 6 months. So again, that makes things very, very difficult for the customs officers to stop or to prevent that from happening. Also, it means that the customs officers were often outnumbered in quite a big way. So between Newquay and Fishguard, here, where there was a lot of salt smuggling, in 1704, customs officials recorded an event where 8 of them, so 8 customs officials, found between 150 and 200 smugglers on the beach. And they were expected to stop them. In the end, they fired their guns into the crowd. But because the smuggling was such a large-scale operation, and because they had so many tubmen and batsmen there, quite often there just weren't enough customs officials to do anything about it. As well as this, the smugglers were often armed. So on one occasion, in Barry Island, which is about here, in 1782, customs officers reported that there was a boat sitting very openly smuggling goods to the mainland with 40 armed men aboard, who were, of course, prepared to stop anybody who tried to interfere with their smuggling. And finally, the smugglers were also fairly ruthless. The best example I have of this is called the Hawkhurst Gang that was operating in Kent. And in 1745, they apparently killed a customs official who was trying to prevent their smuggling. But there are all sorts of stories about them kidnapping and beating and often killing both customs officials and anybody that they suspected of informing on them. So apparently once they buried a customs official alive to kill him, somebody else was put down a well and they dropped rocks onto him. So the smugglers were incredibly ruthless about keeping their operations going, and if this meant hurting law enforcement or killing law enforcement officers in the shape of customs officials, then they were quite prepared to do that. Sometimes the customs officials did get a victory. So, for example, from the Hawkhurst Gang, the 2 leaders were hanged in 1748. His name was Arthur Gray. And 1749, his name was Thomas Kingsmill. A famous Welsh smuggler called William Owen wrote his autobiography in jail before he was hanged in 1747. So sometimes the customs officials did manage to get a conviction. They did manage to capture people and get them convicted and punished, but they had to deal with a massive problem, and there simply weren't enough of them in a lot of cases. The government does try to help with this, so the government introduces a couple of laws to help. For example, in 1718, they introduced something called the Hovering Act. And this makes it illegal for any boat that weighs more than 50 tonnes, another one of my fine boats to illustrate this. Any boat that weighed more than 50 tonnes wasn't allowed within 6 miles of the shore, so it couldn't weigh anchor or park itself within 6 miles of the shore, because that might mean that it was looking to unload goods illegally. Another law that's brought in by the government in 1736 is called the Act of Indemnity. And this makes it a crime punishable by death to injure a customs official. Whoops, didn't mean that colour. A pink noose wouldn't look very good. So injuring a customs official became a crime that was punishable by death. The big thing that makes a difference for the government, though, is in the 1780s, it launches a committee of inquiry to find out why there's so much smuggling. And the committee of inquiry, again, didn't mean to be pink, comes to the conclusion that the problem is really that the tariffs are too high. And so as a result, the government decides to get rid of a lot of the tariffs. So for example, in 1784, the Prime Minister at the time, whose name is William Pitt, reduces the tariff on tea. So here's my teapot. And he reduces that from 119% down to 12.5. And what this means is that suddenly the goods that have been brought into the country legally aren't that much more expensive than the cheap smuggled goods. And the smugglers find that they suddenly have less of a market. Fewer people are prepared to buy their goods, so they can't make quite so much money from bringing them in. And that helps to solve the problem. In the 1840s, the government adopts a free trade policy, which means no tariffs. And that really helps to solve the problem as well. As well as this, the smugglers aren't helped by the Napoleonic Wars. Which happened from 1805 to 1804. I do beg your pardon. There we go. 1804 to 1815. Getting my dates wrong. And what this means is, first of all, that Martello Towers, which look a little bit like this, were built along the southeast coast of England to watch out for any French ships. But they also mean they're quite handy places to watch out for smugglers too. Oh dear, making lots of mistakes with my writing. This is quite a long section with a lot of detail. So it makes it hard for me to keep up. The other thing that this means is that the Royal Navy, represented here by a boat with RN on its flag, begins to patrol the English Channel, and it also blockades French ports, which means that the smugglers can't go to the foreign ports to buy the goods to bring them back to Britain. Finally, the Coast Guard is set up in the 1820s, and again, these are people who patrol the coast and make it very difficult for the smugglers to come in. So that's why smuggling ends. It's not to do with the work of the customs and excise officers, it's to do with the government reducing the tariffs and getting rid of the market for these cheap goods that the smugglers were exploiting. Finally, before we go, it's worth comparing this to another crime which experienced a similar sort of trajectory and a similar sort of pattern. Poaching is the crime of hunting illegally on somebody else's land. And because in the 1700s this was increasingly becoming a gang crime, in 1723 the government introduces a law called the Black Act. And this made poaching a capital offence. But it also made it illegal to be caught in the forests. This is possibly where the name comes from, with a camouflaged face so that you couldn't be seen in the dark. So that became illegal. And also being caught with a snare to catch animals or a dog. So the government increases the punishment for poaching as well, but again, it doesn't work very well, and eventually this act is repealed in the year 1823, very conveniently 100 years later. So poaching is increasingly a problem in the 1700s, but the government solutions don't always work very well.